Welcome back, brothers and sisters. This is Seed Wars number 22, and the last couple lectures we've been looking at these fallen angels. And I think it's important to understand that these are very intelligent beings. We know they came down in Genesis 6 and they contaminated the human genome, but they did more than that. As Enoch says, they revealed the eternal secrets of heaven to man. And once man got a taste for that knowledge, he strived to have more and more and more. And, I don't think these angels revealed all these secrets just because they wanted to run amok of planet Earth. Yeah, it's true. They were going against the Most High God. They wanted to contaminate man genetically. They wanted to introduce sin into our lives and lead us off the path. But really, they did it for their own interests. And that is, these angels want to maintain control over planet Earth. They need to be in the affairs of men in order to control us. And so, if they give us the metallurgy so that we'll be fighting over metals and building little metal altars and statues and worshiping those things, then they're able to control us through that. If they teach us the signs of the sun and the moon and the zodiac and astrology, then that's allowing them to continue to control us, because all of this idolatry that they've taught mankind is just a spiritual doorway that gives them power and control over us spiritually. That's what the as above, so below paradigm really truly means. All the sacred societies believe in this as above, so below, the pyramid up and the pyramid down. What that essentially means is that the spirit realm is being yoked with the physical realm in such a way that the spirit realm is governing what's happening on planet Earth. And that all happens through witchcraft and sorcery and idolatry and the zodiac, everything that these angels have introduced to mankind, and everything that humans have been doing for thousands of years, including today. Now, as far as the Nephilim are concerned, we see some name changes happen after the flood. They're not really referred to as Nephilim anymore, and they're mostly concentrated under the name of the Canaanites. And Canaan was the cursed seed line that would become the illegitimate seed of Ham, who is Noah's son. So Canaan is Noah's cursed grandson, and he has the Nephilim DNA strain living inside of him, and every one of his children become the evil, wicked Canaanites who form the different groups of giants that exist in the Old Testament. And they've got a lot of different names. Some of them were called the Anakims, which we've already reviewed, and that word is pronounced Anunnaki or Anaki. And like we showed several lectures ago, I believe that the New Age version that we see today, the Anunnaki, are really a retelling of these Anakims in the Bible. And that they're not extraterrestrials like the New Age would like us to believe. Also, we see that there are other ones called Amims and Zuzims and Horims. Now, the Amims translate as terrors. They're so scary that's what they mean, terrors. The Zuzims translate as roving creatures. So these are not fully human. These are hybridized human-like people. They're referred to as people and men, but they're hybrids. And then on the last lecture, we looked very closely at the gods that these Nephilim tribes and these Canaanites worship. They worship Baal and Ashtaroth. And Ashtaroth means the double horns. She's also pronounced Astarte, where we get the word star from. But the cities in the Old Testament, like Ashtaroth Karnaim, translate as Ashtaroth of the double horns. And it turns out that she is the official symbol of the five-pointed star, the pentagram. And her male consort, Baal, is the official symbol of the six-pointed star. And we've looked at the talisman of Saturn in the past. It has the 5 and 6-pointed star on the front and the back, and it has the bull with the horns. That is a representation of Baal. And these are sacred geometric shapes that they used in witchcraft and sorcery going all the way back before the flood. Now in the Old Testament, the Canaanites are the ones who conjured up these false gods like Baal, who coincidentally is a hybrid. He has a human's body with the head of a bull. So in a lot of ways, he reminds me of Baphomet. Baphomet has a human body with the head of a goat with horns, a very similar rendition. And so, unfortunately, the Israelites did exactly what God told them not to do. He said, I don't want you spending time with these heathen nations and following after and chasing after their gods. Well, unfortunately, they didn't listen. And they started spending time around these other nations, and eventually they adopted these other gods. And then they started doing child sacrifice in the nation of Israel, specifically in a place that they refer to as the Valley of Hinnom. And we have renditions of that down below. You can see that this is Baal here. They've got a little altar that he's sitting on with fire burning. Down in the bottom right, you see that these men are opening up the door and stoking the fire. And you have this man here who's holding a baby. And, you can see the women here are screaming because their child has just been taken from them. Also, like we see below here, this man is taking this woman's child, and they're getting ready to put it inside of the brazen bull, and they're going to cremate that baby and offer it as a human sacrifice to the bloodthirsty gods of the Canaanites. And this is what the seed of the serpent did in the Old Testament. And unfortunately, the seed of the woman was influenced by that serpent seed line, and they began to participate in this as well. And this is an image of the brazen bull on the golden altar, where they put the victims inside, and you can hear their screams coming out of the mouth of the bull. It's interesting, Jesus says in Matthew 23, when he's talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he says to them, you serpents, you generation of vipers, how are you going to escape the damnation of hell? And, right there, generation of vipers translates as seed of the serpent. And I believe that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were part of the serpent seed, who were really wolves in sheep's clothes, who were masquerading as the religious leaders, but in reality they were this wicked seed line who had hijacked Judaism at that time in history. And when Jesus says, how are you going to escape the damnation of hell? The word hell translates as Gehenna, and that word means the Valley of Hinnom, where the Canaanites taught the Israelites how to sacrifice the babies. And so what Jesus is really saying here is he's using the Valley of Hinnom figuratively as a name for hell, as a name for everlasting punishment. And in other words, he's telling them, that the seed of the serpent, that you know what? You're going to end up in a place called hell, Gehenna. And they understood that to be analogous to the Valley of Hinnom, where they used to burn the babies. Now you can see what it says in Judges 3. Now these are the nations which the Lord left, that he might test Israel by them, that is, all who had not known any of the wars in Canaan. This was only so that the generations of the children of Israel might be taught to know war, at least those who had not formerly known it. Namely, 5 lords of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites who dwelt in Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon to the entrance of Hamath. So what we're seeing here is that God is basically testing the nation of Israel. He's allowed some of the serpent seed to survive for several reasons. One, to test the nation of Israel to see if they're going to fall into idolatry. And 2, because for the proto-evangelium to continue to lead up to the crucifixion of the Messiah, there's going to have to be the seed of the serpent. If God were to wipe them all out with a flood, then that prophecy would not be fulfilled. So he allows some of them he allows some of that DNA of the serpent seed to survive the flood so that the proto-evangelium can continue to be manifested throughout time. All of these groups here are all different Nephilim groups. The Philistines are where Goliath comes from. We know that he is a remnant of the giant. Then, of course, all of the Canaanites are the wicked serpent seed line, as well as the Sidonians. Canaan's firstborn son was Sidon, the father of the Sidonians. So that's just another name for the Canaanites, and the Hivites as well. Now, they all live up in the mountains, like Bashan and Baal Hermon, which is at the base of Mount Hermon. We know the book of Enoch says that the fallen angels in Genesis 6 descended upon Mount Hermon. That's where they made the oath to contaminate the human women. So it makes sense that, 1,000 years later, in the book of Judges, these Canaanites, who are ancestors of the fallen angels and the Nephilim of Genesis 6, are worshiping these fallen angels at Mount Hermon itself. That is very cohesive, because that's where the pact was, that's where the agreement was made. Verse 4, and they were left that he might test Israel by them to know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their father by the hand of Moses. So God is testing the nation of Israel by allowing them to be thrust in the midst of these heathen nations to see how they're going to stand. Are they going to stick with the morals and values that were taught to them by their fathers, going all the way back to Moses? Or are they going to fall away from those values and begin to adopt the values of these wicked hybrid nations? Verse 5, we're about to find out what they did. Thus the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, all which are different hybrid strains, and they took their daughters to be their wives. God told them specifically, do not blend the two seed lines. Do not mix the seed of the woman with the seed of the serpent. But they did. They took their daughters to be their wives, and they gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the groves. Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. So we see here that they served the Baals and the groves. Now the groves is a very interesting concept. That word is the Asherah, and it has to do with Asheroth or Astarte, the Canaanite goddess that we've looked at previously. And what we see in the Bible is that these Canaanite groups would go into the forests of Bashan and Syria and Lebanon. Those were notorious for having big groves of trees. We know about the cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan. And they would fashion these sacred trees into poles, and at the top of the poles they would put images of these stars that represented the wandering stars in the sky, the planets like Saturn and Venus and so on and so forth. And these are known as Asherah poles. We see this here in Deuteronomy 7. God says, but you shall deal with him, you shall destroy their altars and break down their images and cut down their groves and burn their graven images with fire. And in 2 Kings, they left the commandments of the Lord their God, and they made molten images, even 2 calves, and they made a grove, and they worshiped the host of heaven and served Baal. So the idolatry pretty much all looks the same in the Old Testament. It has to do with using the metals and putting together molten images of the bulls and other objects to represent the gods. And then they would go into the groves, which are the forests, and they would put up these Asherah poles, which we'll look at in a moment. And they would worship the hosts of heaven, the different planetary bodies in the sky, who they believed to be the gods. And those planetary bodies represented Baal and Moloch and Asherah, who are fallen angels and deities that exist underneath Satan. Now, I'd like to show you how even today we still see some of this idolatry echoing what took place in the Old Testament. We have a group called the Bohemian Grove, which is a private San Francisco-based gentlemen's club for some of the richest and most prominent men in the world. Now, when we read in verses like Judges that the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, they forgot the Lord their God, and they served Baal and Moloch, and they went into the groves. I'm going to show you a modern day representation of this. Turns out that Baal and Moloch, one of the images we see today for Baal and Moloch is the owl. And the reason that the owl is an image is because the owl has two horns on his head that represent the double horns of Baal and Ashtaroth. Now, there's this famous Bohemian Grove in San Francisco that happens every year since the founding of the United States. And when we've looked at it in the past, for example, down here in the bottom left, we see 1977 Bohemian Grove Camp. We see very famous and powerful men like Henry Kissinger, ex-president Gerald Ford, and many of the richest, most powerful men in the world. Here in the center, we see images of President Nixon, President Reagan. And so, this is where some of the most famous, influential men in the world go. And we know that they do all kinds of very deep occult rituals to this 40-foot owl rock formation that they have that you see here in the bottom right. In fact, one of the reenactments that they perform is something called the cremation of care. Now, this is a photo going all the way back to 1907. And if you zoom in and look at it, you'll see people dressed in black and white hoods. It's very reminiscent of a KKK rally. And what the cremation of care ceremony is said to be is a ritual that's performed by the club members, in which it was originally set up with the plot of something called the High Jinks, which is a dramatic performance in which they try to destroy the spirit known as Care, which is slain by the Jinx hero throughout a cremation episode. So the ceremony basically serves as a catharsis for pent-up spirits and to present symbolically the salvation of the trees by the club. The cremation of care was to become an exorcising of the demons to ensure the success of their future. And what they essentially do is they have this great big reenactment where dark hooded figures take an effigy or a mannequin of this entity called Care, and they put it into the fire at the base of this 40-foot owl, which represents Moloch. Now, they say that the cremation symbolizes that the members are banishing the cares and worries of their conscience, and that for many years there was a recording of the voice of club member Walter Cronkite, which was used during the ceremony. So, obviously, when you put this in context, we have some of the most powerful men in the world who are going out to the forests outside of San Francisco and putting on dark robes and doing rituals where they're throwing supposedly these effigies of a human body into a cremation ceremony in order to exorcise the demons so that their conscience can be set free of the wickedness that they've done in their lives. And for all we know, they're, performing true human sacrifice. Nobody really knows what's transpiring for sure, but in my opinion, it's just a reenactment of what was going on in the days of the Old Testament when the serpent seed were worshiping Baal and Moloch in the groves. Now, I'd like to take a minute and just kind of study the history of the Asherah pole, because there's a lot of information out there that is very interesting. The Asherah pole started off as a sacred tree, and then over time they incorporated the planets or the stars with the double horns. And then later, the Egyptians adopted this through the obelisk, which is the tall pyramidal-shaped tower that they have all throughout Egypt that later the Romans adopted And then eventually even we adopted here in America with the Washington Monument. But we see lots of verses that talk about the altars and the images that were raised in the groves. And these altars and images are these Asherah poles with these 5 and 6 pointed stars placed at the top. And what we find is that eventually they become obelisks, and that these obelisks have been placed all around the world. We see today that there are obelisks everywhere from Paris to New York City to London to Washington, D.C. to even Vatican City. There's even renditions of the Mount Sinai incident where Moses went to get the tablets and Aaron made the golden calf, that they put that on top of an Asherah pole up high. Because when you worship the gods, they're up here. So the taller you can get them, the higher you can get them, the better. And so it's an interesting concept. When you start looking at the history of why do we have the things that we have, it gets really interesting, because essentially what the research reveals is that everything has just been an echo and a repeat of the previous culture. For example, the idea of the Capitol building and the Washington Monument, that came from Rome. It's an exact replica or likeness of what the Roman pagan system did. And you find out that the Romans got their ideas from the Egyptians. And prior to the Egyptians, it was going on in Babylon. And before Babylon, it was going on before the flood with the fallen angels and the world that they had created then. And so you begin to realize that these fallen angels have been meddling in the affairs of men and having humanity continue to just replicate the same idolatry over and over and over. For example, we know that the Egyptians were making these obelisks going back millennia. And these big, tall obelisks represent the sun god Horus. And we know the Romans were sun worshippers. In fact, Roman Emperor Augustus, he went to Heliopolis, Egypt in 10 BC and dismantled one of these obelisks and took it back to Rome, where the Vatican is. And the reason he found it in Heliopolis is because Heliopolis was the city of the sun god. That's what helio means. And as we'll see in a moment, this is actually a sundial. But we have a history of the Roman popes who were obsessed with these obelisks. And Constantine II also took one of these obelisks and put it in Rome. And they were putting them in their circuses. The Circus Maximus and the Circus of Nero. This is, shortly after Christ ascended. We know that Nero put up, large area where they had all the gladiators performing their sports and where they had all the horse races and everything. And you see an image of that down here in the bottom right. This is called the Circus Neronis in Vaticano. And you see a big image of the obelisk with a star at the top of it, because this represented the sun gods. And so this is where the Vatican City got it from. We know that later Pope Sixtus V had one of these obelisks moved to Vatican City to St. Peter's Square, where we still see it today. So when you look at an image of St. Peter's Square down below, it's an exact replica of what we have in Washington, D.C. And the building here, the dome and the obelisk, were harvested from Egypt because they were used to worship the sun god. Now, what's really interesting is that the Babylonians had this exact same thing. They called it an Asherah pole. And later they actually named it a Baal shaft, because they said that it represented the phallus of the sun god Baal. The Egyptian and Babylonian temples would strategically build these structures to face the rising sun, and they believed that the sun was God, and that the sun would rise in the morning through the god Horus, which means horizon, and that he would charge the Baal shaft with vital energy that would then be emitted into the dome, which is the womb, and that would bring about the spirit of Osiris into the Pharaoh. It was a very deep occult ritual that we're going to take a look at here in more detail in a moment. But we see in all of the occult writings like Manly Hall's Secret Teaching of All Ages and The Secret Destiny of America, he says that the god Osiris shall rise again, that the monument, the Washington Monument, which serves as the pyramid, shall stand as the ideal emblem of resurrection and regeneration, so that Horus can be reborn. Now, most people know that Washington, D.C. was based on Masonic principles with sacred geometry, which we'll review in a moment. Now, I think Tom Horn's done the best job of explaining this, but essentially what we're about to discuss can be applied to the inauguration of the pharaohs in Egypt. It can be applied to the inauguration of the popes in Rome, and it can be applied to the inauguration of the presidents in America. But going back into the days of Egypt, every year on the summer solstice, they had something called the Festival of Ophet. Now notice the timeline. It's during the summer solstice. How did man learn about the summer solstice? We know the fallen angels taught them those secrets. During the Festival of Ophet, the new pharaoh would go into the dome and a ceremony is performed. When the sun god Horus arose in the morning, the energy from the sun, which was known as the seed or the sperm, would travel up the Baal shaft of the obelisk, starting at the base, which is where the testes are, and then eventually it would be magically emitted into the dome, which represents the womb of Isis. And this is where the spirit of Osiris would be incarnated into the pharaoh, and this would be the resurrection of Horus. Now, this whole process is called transmogrification, where essentially Pharaoh enters the dome as a man, but he exits as a living god, a deity. He's been transmogrified into a god. You can see how deeply occultic it is that this Antichrist spirit is being raised, and then this spirit is being harnessed and put and possessed into the person of Pharaoh. Meanwhile, temple prostitutes were inside having ritual sex as a form of imitative magic. And this is thought to be where sex magic actually derives from. And so over time, the obelisk would go on to be a symbol that represents not only the male phallus of the sun god, but it also represents regeneration and resurrection of the sun god Osiris or Horus. And so when we look at the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., the Masonic cabal and the deep Kabbalists understand that worships resurrection of Osiris, who is the sun god. And it's interesting when you look at the symbol for the sun god, it's a circle with a dot in it. And that'll become relevant in a moment when we look at a topographical image of the monuments. One thing I'd like to say here is I've heard a lot of anti-Christian folks who've studied the occult over the years say, look, Jesus was not the first idea of a resurrection story, but rather Christianity just really got that idea from the previous cultures, because all of the cultures going back to Babylon and the Persians and the Egyptians, they all have stories of resurrection and regeneration. But what I'd like to demonstrate a significant difference between them is all of those previous resurrection stories were all symbolic and spiritual. There was never a time where they believed that Horus was a literal man who was resurrected from the dead, who occupied a literal body, and that he interacted with people. It was always this symbolic spiritual resurrection of the sun god resurrecting in the sky every morning. Whereas Jesus is a literal, physical, and bodily resurrection, which is obviously a big difference from a symbolic resurrection. So when you go to Vatican City, and you go to St. Peter's Square, we see that there is an obelisk. And this is one of the exact obelisks that were actually taken down from Heliopolis, Egypt, where they worship the sun god. And that's the reason why the Romans harvested it in the first place, because the Romans were known sun worshippers as well. And when you look at it, you can quite clearly see that it's a sundial. In fact, it has the 4 quadrants, just like we see down here with a compass. It has the north, east, south, and western hemispheres, and these are quarters. This is the first quarter of the day, the second quarter of the day, the third, and the fourth quarter of the day. And depending on where the sun hits the obelisk, it casts the shadow, which allows the person to know what the time is. So we're basically looking at an ancient sundial, if you will, before they had, clocks and timepieces. And it was a brilliant way to tell time, but it's deeper than that, because they believed that the sun was God. And so, this represents the sun god. And when you look at it from the top looking down, it's obviously a circle with a dot in the middle of it, which is exactly what we see over here on the bottom right. That is an image of the sun god Ra and Horus. And so we can know that the Roman pagan system adopted this into Vatican City as a version of worshiping the sun god. And it's very clear that that's where we got the idea for Washington, D.C. Everything about Washington, D.C. has occult roots. All of the Babylonian Masonic serpent seed line are the ones who laid it out. We see on the bottom left that it was laid out as a 5-pointed star. We now know that that is the star of Ashtaroth, or the female goddess of Baal and Moloch. We see that the pentagon was shaped into a 5-sided image as well. And the more you study DC, the more you'll find that there are Masonic roots. Washington, D.C. was meant to be a likeness of Rome. Rome had the eagle as their official standard, and that's where we got the idea for the eagle. Studies reveal that that was actually originally a phoenix, which can be dated all the way back to the Phoenicians, who were the Canaanites, the seed of the serpent. And we know that even the way our government was set up with a democratic republic, the Senate, it's all built off Rome. Rome had the Senate, the Roman Senate, and they were a republic very similar to us. And unfortunately, if you study the collapse of Rome, it's going to be the same collapse of the United States, because the blueprint's always been the same. At the end of Rome's life, they had public works programs where they had everybody living off the system, welfare lines and bread lines. They were devaluing their currency by diluting their gold denarii with bronze and other junk metals, and so they caused inflation. And they thought that they were the world policemen, so they strung out their military all across the planet, and eventually they just were overcome and they succumbed to all of that. And so, we're seeing the same thing over and over and over. And when you study DC, we see a lot of owl imagery. We know that the owl represents Baal and Moloch. We see an image of an owl built around the White House. We know that they've concealed an owl on the front of the dollar bill. And of course, when you study the dollar bill, we see the unfinished pyramid and all of the different Egyptian iconography. And this is why Hollywood and music are so enshrouded with all of the Egyptology, because it has to do with the modern day worship of these same sun gods. See, the seed of the serpent of the Old Testament, they're still alive and well. They are the Luciferian cabal that's running the world today, and they're still worshiping the same sun gods. That's why when you watch videos like Katy Perry, it shows her rising up the pyramid to become a goddess. She's becoming Astarte, and we see the pyramid pointing up and the pyramid pointing down. That's the six-pointed star, and that represents Baal and Moloch and Ashtaroth. And we notice above that we see the rising sun, the sun god Horus, and there's a doorway right here, and this represents the pineal gland, and as does this, the eye of Horus over here, which we've looked at in the past, is a sagittal dissection of the human brain, which makes up the pineal gland. And they use the pineal gland to open up the third eye and allow Horus to manifest into this world. But you'll see, like for example, here on her record, here's an image of a pyramid pointing up and a pyramid pointing down. And so all of this is just deep, occult, esoteric symbolization of the seed of the serpent and the idolatry that's gone forth for thousands of years to the sun god. I mean, I've said before, I suspect when the fallen angels descend upon the United States of America, they probably look at each other and say, I'm having deja vu right now, because this is very reminiscent of what it was like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, before the flood. Today they've put up the Temple of Baal in New York City, and occultists say that it represents a metaphysical gateway to allow the spirit of Baal to manifest in the United States. We know that to make Baal happy, you have to have human sacrifice. We know that New York City is one of the most prolific abortion states that there is, and in some contexts now you can even abort babies after they're born. And so, it's not a coincidence that they put the Temple of Baal in the Big Apple, because it has to do with the seed of the serpent, which goes all the way back to the garden. And it's just fascinating that when you go back in time and you look at the original Arch of Baal, it was in the city of Baalbek. And Baalbek is where we have these great big, huge 1,500-ton stones that to this day nobody understands how they quarried them. But, I believe it was the giants of Genesis 6 are the ones who made these. They had the eternal secrets of heaven, and they had the supernatural size and strength and power. And so they're the ones who were building all of these Masonic Babylonian temples to the gods. And they taught this all to mankind, and that became the secret society of the Masons that still exists today. But maybe someone can explain why they're putting up the Temple of Baal all around the world today, including in the United States. And the only logical answer is that the same serpent seed that's been on the planet for thousands of years, the ones who are existing back in Noah's day, are the same fallen angels who were exerting their influence on the Babylonians, and then they just moved along to the Egyptians and the Romans, and now they're here today, meddling in the affairs of men and controlling the world. Only now they're finally getting ready to move us into the last days system, where we're moving into the mark of the beast and the one world currency and the one world system. And the mark of the beast I believe is going to be a genetic manipulation where you receive the serpent seed DNA, the same DNA that's been preserved going all the way back from the days of Noah. And those who receive it are going to become part of the serpent seed line. And they're no longer going to be able to be redeemed by the Son of the living God. And so I think this is a good place to stop, and we'll just pick it up where we left off on the next one. And on that note, Godspeed, and we'll see you on the next one.